All right, Shabbos, say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning. To thank our annual Talmud Torah sponsor, the Tilsim Mishpacha of Eretz Yisrael, for dedicating all the Shir and Drushos this year as a zechus for B'soros Tovos Am Yisrael. Our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Elul, Habalin Latova Bennett Goldberg, for an aliyah for the neshamas of his precious parents, Avram ben Asher Pinchas, Fega Rezel Bas Zelig, and in the hope that the tefillos of our beautiful kehillah are accepted on high. Emir Hashem this Chodesh Elul. Shmuel Lieber Dinovitz, Leilu Nishmas David Flum's father, Harav Ari Flum, Yitzchak Aryeh Ben Achavar, Yaakov Zichron Lebrach. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the neshamas Alav and Aliyah, the families and Nechama, all those in need of refuah Shavon Kedot Kol Cholei Yisrael. Kodesh Baruch, we should Emir Hashem bring home our hostages, B'Shalom and B'Karv, and allow our holy soldiers to be successful. B'chol Masei Yedehem. Well, so with that, let's begin. We have a great daf ahead of us today, really great daf. Today's daf is Ayin 70, and we are picking up on Samech Tesla Beis 69b, 6 lines up from the bottom. Mechimi Achar, the Kamelon Kavas, Rabbi Shmuel Gamliel, the Lochayish L'Shtuma. So, remember again, the Gemara now says as follows. After we establishing yesterday's daf, that we pass Rabbi Shmuel Gamliel. Now, what does Rabbi Shmuel Gamliel say? Remember, we had a machlokes in the Mishnah that if I leave an akum alone with my wine, at what point in time does the wine become yayin esech? So there are really two factors. Number one, does the akum think that I'm coming back? I could be coming back immediately. So if he thinks I could be coming back immediately, ultimately, again, the wine remains mutter. If he knows I'm going to be gone for a little while, how long do I have to be gone in order for the wine to become problematic? That is machlokes in the Mishnah. Tanakama said enough time to bore a hole in the seal, take the wine, plug it back up. Shmuel Gamliel says no, because that type of tampering is detectable. Instead, what's the shear? The amount of time to lop off the lid of the barrel, drink from the wine, and then replace the lid. So we'll say, so essentially the Gemara really came out as paskening like Rabbi Shmuel Gamliel, that the amount of time is the amount of time again for lid replacement. Take off the lid, drink the wine, replace the lids. The Gemara says, now that we pass the Rabbi Shmuel Gamliel to L'Chayish L'Shtuma, who's not worried about, who doesn't feel that anybody's going to plug the barrel. So therefore, halacha l'maisa, again, we're confident, well, that's the shear. So in other words, it's about lid replacement. After we've established that, the Gemara says, furthermore, v'hilchos hakavasei Rabbi Eliezer. Now, both say, and the halacha also follows Rabbi Eliezer. Now, what does Rabbi Eliezer hold? We had Rabbi Eliezer earlier, actually. And Rabbi Eliezer said, Rashi points this out, that in general, as long as you have one siman on the wine, then the akum's not going to tamper with it. Why not? An akum is going to tamper with the wine when? Number one, well, when he's not going to be discovered. And number two, when it's easy. If there's any effort involved in it, most probably he's not going to do it. And that's how we paskin. Therefore, even if you have one siman, let's say one seal, ultimately, again, that is enough to pretty much prevent the akum from tampering with it. So the Gemara asks an interesting question. So now that we say that halacha l'maisa, the shear for tampering is replacement of the lid, furthermore, we assume that if the barrel is sealed, essentially, the akum really is not going to do anything with it because it's not worth the trouble cracking the seal, opening the lid, creating a new lid. He's not going to do it. So if that's the case, the Gemara is very interesting. Ha'idna, my time alomos svinan chamra v'yad of tekochavim. So why don't we leave our sealed barrels with an akum? Right? I mean, in other words, you hear the shaila. If at the end of the day, we are confident that halacha l'maisa, again, one seal is pretty much enough to go ahead and prevent the akum from tampering with it. Why don't we just leave our barrels of sealed wine with an akum? To which the Gemara says, interestingly enough, mishum shaycha, because of the shaycha. What's the shaycha? Rashi says, that's Rashi in the daf, nekev dak shehu ma'od shub magufa sachavis lios reich hayayin yosi. So apparently, what they used to have in their barrels is they'd have an air hole. There would be a small little hole in the seal of the barrel that would allow, I guess, some of the gases from the fermentation process to escape. Therefore, again, technically speaking, there is access to the wine through that air hole. So that's ultimately, again, what really gives us pause when we leave wine with an akum. Okay, Amar Rav says as follows. What's the interesting case here? Zona ovedas kochavim v'yisrael musubin etzla. So watch this. Let's say you have Jews, and these Jews are going to a non-Jewish zona, okay? And they have wine. Now, it's their wine. So they're sitting with her, right? Jews, zona, non-Jewish zona, Jewish wine. So what's the halacha? Shari. The wine is permitted. The wine is permitted. Now, why don't you have to be concerned that the zona akum over there is going to make it yayin nesach? So we'll say this is incredible. Nehi de takif lo yitzra da avera, top of ayin, yitzra de yayin nesach lo sakif lo. Just because a Jew is seized and can't overcome the Yetzer Hara for immorality, doesn't mean that he's committing Avoda Zara. All right, once you hear this, in other words, what's the Havamina? The Havamina is like this. If this guy is sitting anyway by the zona, obviously, again, going to commit an Avera with her, so perhaps, again, he's not makbid on his wine either, and will allow his wine to be touched ultimately. Marty, thank you so much. Thank you. Will allow his wine ultimately, again, to be touched by this zona, and ultimately, again, becomes Yayin Esach. The Gemara says, no, just because someone is immoral doesn't mean that they're an idolater. We'll say, what a profound and beautiful Musar Haskell. Essentially, just because I commit certain Averas doesn't make me all bad. Doesn't make me all bad. We all commit Averas. So we'll say the nature of life is we all commit Averas, so we have areas in life in which we are weak, and we have areas of life in which, Baruch Hashem, we are able to maintain a sense of spiritual strength. And just because I am compromised in certain areas does not mean I'm compromised in all areas. And this is a tremendously important yesod. One of the greatest obstacles to tshuva is a lack of self-worth. I feel that because I have sinned, therefore I am damaged goods, I am compromised, and I really can't ever get myself back on the rails. There is nothing further from the truth. I mean, there is a lot of truth in there. I have sinned, I am compromised, I have gotten myself off the rails, but I'm not down and out. Just because I've made mistakes in life in no way precludes me from rebuilding and rehabilitating myself. Just because I've fallen prey to the Yetzer Hara for immorality doesn't mean that therefore I'm also an Oved Avoda Zara. So incredible. What about another case? What about the following case? Zoni Yisraelis, also watch this. What happens if you have a Jewish zona? Unfortunately, you have a Jewish woman who's a zona, and she's sitting together with her clients with the Ovdei Avoda Zara. Now she has wine on the table. What's the halacha? Chamra aser. In that case, her wine is aser. In other words, what do we have to be concerned about over here? That the Ovdei Kochavim are going to touch her wine. So the Gemara says, yes, you have to be concerned about that. And ultimately, again, her wine is aser. My time, what's the reason for this? Hoil v'zela alayhu basraihu gerera. There's a difference in this case because they look down on her, right? Because again, they figured that she's a zona. So because she's a zona, ultimately, again, she doesn't have any importance in their eyes. So therefore, they will take liberties with her property as well. And therefore, we have to assume, ultimately, again, we have to assume that halacha l'maisa, the wine ultimately again becomes yayin nesach. Incredible. Which I will say is also very interesting, right? This distinction between the Jews with the akum zona versus the non-Jews, the akum with the Jewish zona. And it's interesting that the whole yisod over here is that they look down on her. See, I will say ultimately again, the way you view yourself and the way you hold yourself ultimately represents the way the world will look at you. So this zona, unfortunately, by becoming a zona, has clearly abdicated her personalistic holiness and doesn't feel right. A woman who never has to resort to this, who does resort to this type of work, presumably lacks a certain sense of self. So if you lack a sense of self, the world will also respond to you in that same way. So therefore, again, she lacks a sense of self. Therefore, again, halacha l'maisa, the akum is going to go ahead and treat her with a lack of respect and dignity as well, and therefore take liberties with her wine as well. Incredible. Hu beisa taviyasa b'chamr d'Yisrael. It was an interesting case. There was a house, and in this house was stored Jewish wine. Okay, so we'll say, so now interesting enough, so what happened? I guess it was a storehouse. So what occurred? All Ovid Kochavim achta l'dasha bape. And Akum ran into the house, and ultimately again closed the door behind him. Closed the door, ran into the house and locked the door behind him. All right, so I'll say, so now what happens? V'hava biza bidasha. And now there was a hole in the door itself. So therefore the Yisrael was able to see through the hole into some of the barrels of wine. Ishtachach Ovid Kochavim, the Kai Beni Dani, and he saw through the hole that the Akum was standing between the barrels. Okay, Amar Rava, suppose I say now, what's the shaila? What's the shaila? Shaila is, what's the status of the wine? Right? Because remember, there's a lot of stuff that's strange over here. What's strange? Number one, that Yaakov ran into the storehouse. And what did he do? That's strange, number one. Number two, what else? He locked the door. Right? What else? We find him standing between the barrels. So now what's the status of the wines? Amar Rava, this is very interesting. Called the have biza shari. Any barrels that you could see like opposite the opening in the door, ultimately, again, will remain permitted, right? Because like we'll say, the logic is like this. Since the akum knows that he could be seen through the opening of the door, therefore what? Therefore, halacha l'maisa, again, he's not going to tamper with the wine. However, the high gisa, all the barrels on the two sides, in other words, anything you can't see from the hole in the door, ultimately, again, is going to be aser. Okay, interesting. But now it's another interesting case. You had a Jew and a non-Jew, a Jew and an Akum who shared a home. The Jew lived on the upper story, the Akum lived on the lower story, and the wine was kept on the lower story of the house. Now what happened? Now, interestingly enough, the Gemara says, Shamu kol tigra. Now, the Gemara says over here, Rashi says, V'yayim b'tachtona v'Yisrael ra'el milamala. So apparently there was like a hole in the floor, and the Yisrael was normally able to see down. He was able to see his wine on the first floor. Okay, good. What happened? Shamu kol tigra. So they heard a commotion outside. Nafki. And so the Jew and the Akum left their homes, went out to see what's all the commotion. Asa kadim asa ovei kochav achada l'dasha ba'apei. After they're standing outside, goes back in and closes his door behind him. So I say now, what's the shaila? The shaila is now the akum was effectively inside the home with a closed door, just with the Jewish wine. So what's the status of the wine? Amar Rava says chamra shari. The wine is going to be mutter. Why? Meimar Amar, because the akum will say ki hechi de kadem asay ana kadem va'asi yisrael neised ba'yona v'kachazili. Because the akum will say like this: the same way that I came into the house, closed the door behind me, so Bepashtos, my upstairs neighbor, the Jew, also ran back inside, and he's able to see me from his upper story home. So therefore, the Akum is not going to do anything. So we'll say, bottom line, we're seeing the same theme over and over, which is the concept of mirsis. An Akum will do something to the wine if he can get away with it. If he's going to be discovered, or if there's a fear of being discovered, he is not going to tamper with the wine. Now, the other principle we're going to see is also, and again, we'll see these cases are based on, we'll see more specifically later on, an Akum will also only tamper with wine when he has a legitimate excuse for being in the proximity of the wine, right? In other words, if he has no excuse for being next to the wine, then Lamai saying he's not going to tamper with it. Why? Because he could be accused of theft. And if there's theft, then he could be held liable. So that's why if you notice in all of these cases, the Akum has legitimate access. So there has to be legitimate access, and ultimately, again, a time frame in which he feels he could do whatever he wants without being discovered. But if there's a fear of discovery, right, even if there's legitimate access, ultimately he's not going to tamper with the wine. Incredible. Another case. Hoshpiza. Another case. Hoshpiza. There was Hoshpiza as an inn. There was an inn in which the wine of a Jew was housed. Okay. So when they went in the inn one time, they saw that there was an akum who was sitting in between the barrels. So we'll say, so now the shaila is, what's the status of the wine? Some of Rava said, "Nitbas alav kiganav shari." If at the end of the day, so the ganav has no legitimate reason to be there, and if he's found there, he could be accused of being a thief. Then ultimately, again, the wine is permitted. Now, what does this mean? The wine is permitted. Look at Rashi. Shari. It's in the short lines. In the shorter lines, about 4 lines in. Shari kol shari dahacha shari af b'shtia. The halo naga kamrinan v'chal asr dahacha asr b'afanav. So Rashi just points out, whenever the Gemara says permitted, permitted means permitted even for consumption. So the idea over here is, if there's no legitimate reason why the akum would be there, the wine is permitted, because we assume that there's a mirsis, there's a fear of discovery, and ultimately, again, a fear of being accused of being a thief. Therefore, he's not going to tamper with the wine. But if at the end of the day there is no fear of being accused of being a thief, then asir, ultimately, again, the wine is asir because the akum will render it yayin nesach. So we'll say same principle. In other words, in order for us to have a yain nesach concern, number one, there has to be a legitimate reason why the akum would be present by the wine, and number two, no fear of discovery. No fear of discovery. Next, Hubesa, there was a home in which Jewish wine was kept. And they found an akum who was there standing between the barrels. Okay. Amar Rava says, essentially, if he could find an excuse for why he is there, if he has a good excuse for why he's there, then the wine is aser. The Gemara says, but if he doesn't have a good excuse, in other words, we'll say chamra shari, which is another way of saying like this. If he could explain why he's there, then he has legitimacy for being there. Then we have to be concerned about tampering. If he knows that he has no legitimate reason for being there and can be accused of theft, ultimately, again, then we could assume he did not tamper with the wine, and the wine ultimately, again, is going to be mutter. Take a look at Rashi for just a moment. Rashi, right? If he has no ability to kind of explain away why he's there, Velomar, lekach nichnasti, sam chadaiti velo mirsas, dechi al lahach beisami kara adaiti linasuche al. So I'll say, so again, if he has a good reason for why he's there, so we really have to go ahead and assume that the wine is yayin nesach. Why? Because since he has a good reason, essentially he has an alibi. I don't know if alibi is the right word. He has a story, right? He has an explanation as to why he's there. So because he has an explanation, he has a cover story. Because he has a cover story, we have to be concerned that really he may have made this wine into yayin nesach. Incredible. Nin al hapundak o shamar lo shamar. So we'll say this is a very interesting case. So let's say an akum goes into an inn and he closes the door behind him, and there's Jewish wine inside of the inn. Or, for that matter again, a Jew said to an akum, watch my wine, guard my wine. In both of these cases, the Gemara says, aser, the wine is going to be aser. Rashi says, the chayshin and dilma all, the chayvan damrele shmar sam chadayte mafagmine. So this is interestingly enough, so both these cases, the wine is aser. Now, why is the wine aser? So bepashtos rabosai. So in these cases, the akum has the ability to be there, and apparently he's not concerned the Jew's going to pop up. So the Gemara says, now 1 second. My love, afagav the. Are we not dealing with a case? We're not dealing with a case where the akum doesn't have a good cover story for why he's there. To which the Gemara says, no. But the isle no. We're talking about a case over here where halacha l'maisa again, the akum does have a good explanation why he's there, right? So because he does have a good explanation why he's there, now obviously the second case is more obvious, right? Where the Jew says to the akum, guard my wine. So first of all, in general, when you ask someone to guard something, generally that can mean that's why you're going to be gone for a little while. So he figures he's got time and he's allowed to be there. That case obviously is aser. The Gemara is more focused on the first case where the akum goes into the inn, locks the door. We said the wine is aser. So now the Gemara says, by the way, that's a case where the akum has a legitimate cover story, right? So he could explain why he's there. Since he could explain why he's there, therefore, halacha l'maisa, the wine is going to be aser. Okay. We'll say an interesting case. A Jew and a non-Jew were sitting and drinking wine together. And I will say what's fascinating about this, by the way, is that halacha l'maisa, right? This is like against everything that we spoke about, right? So all of the gzeras that we had is exactly like to prevent a Jew from sitting down and having a glass of wine with a non-Jew. All right, in any event, the Gemara says they're sitting and drinking together. What happened? This is actually beautiful. Shama Yisrael kol saluye bekinishta. So they're sitting, opposite a shul, right there in a cafe opposite a shul. And what happens? What does the Jew hear? Starting mincha. So what happens? Come, vazal. And we'll say, what does a yid do when he hears the sound of davening? What does he do? There's only one thing he does. He runs towards it. How can you not run towards such a sweet and melodic sound? So he gets up and he goes, well, obviously, what's the problem? He left his wine on the table. Kam va'az amar Rava, chamra shari. So Rava says, ultimately again, the wine is permitted. Why? You must listen to this. Meimar amar hashta mitkarle lechamre v'hadra asi. This is very interesting. The akum, what doesn't he know? He doesn't know how long mincha is. Right? So by the way, Also, wives also sometimes don't know how long mincha is, right? Especially when you have little kids and you have to do bedtime. That somehow mincha ma'ariv is like an hour and a half. It's incredible how that works, right? So I'll say so ultimately again. So it says the akum doesn't know. He doesn't know how long davening is. So we'll say, so once again, so therefore, because he doesn't know, there's a mirsas. Just keep remembering that word. There's a fear that the Jew is just going to reappear. So because he's going to reappear, therefore the akum ultimately, again, is not going to tamper with the wine. Very interesting. We'll say this is a fascinating one. Listen to this. There was a Jew and a non-Jew. Jew and a non-Jew. The Havu Yasvi Ba'arva. They were sitting on a boat. Sitting on a boat. Okay, and again, with wine. Shema Yisrael, Kol Shipuri Debe Shimshi. So both said this is really very, very beautiful. The Jew heard the shofar blasts of Erev Shabbos, the siren. They both said, and Rashi points out over here, Rashi says, Shipur Debe Shimshi, Shal Erev Shabbos, Shayu Tokin Lahavdil, Be Kodesh Chavosai. I think many of us would agree the most incredible thing of Eretz Yisrael and Erev Shabbos is that siren. It's in that moment that you understand what it means to be in the Jewish homeland. You see, in Galus, I'm a Jew who's observing Shabbos in a foreign culture, in a foreign land. In Eretz Yisrael, right? The land observes Shabbos, irrespective of what the people do, right? In other words, Eretz Yisrael observes Shabbos. So therefore, again, they're sitting there. And by the way, they used to blow these shofars in Bavel also. It wasn't just in Eretz Yisrael. They blow it in Bavel. So the Gemara says as follows. In any event, the Jew and the non-Jew are sitting on a boat. It's Erev Shabbos. The Jew hears, my gosh, the shofar just blasted, which means Shabbos is starting imminently, right? And this was Shipur Debe Shimshi. The Gemara Masech Shabbos says there were different blasts that they blew at different times. This was the blast right before Ben Hashmoshos, which means Shabbos is starting imminently. Nafik va'azil. So what happened? The Jew left. He left. Now, obviously, he left his wine. So the shayla now is, what's the status of the wine? Amar Rava. Rava says, Chamra Shari. The wine is permitted. Now, why? Meima Amar Hashta Mitkali Lechamre Va Hadra Asya. Both say this is wild. Why? Because Yaakov says to himself, the Jew, Reuven's going to realize he forgot his wine. He's going to come back for it. V'mishum Shabbos. What about Shabbos? How is he coming back for his wine? Right? But Pashtos, again, he can't carry it. So how is he coming back ultimately again for his wine? Rashi says, V'mishum Shabbos. V'im Tomar, the Samcha Daite Dovi Kochav Mishum Dolo Asi Yisrael B'Shabbos. So 1 second. This both say, this case, the wine should for sure be Asr. Why should it be Asr? Because they both say, first of all, the Jew ran out for Shabbos. Second of all, he can't come back for his wine on Shabbos. He can't carry that wine on Shabbos. It's Otzah, right? He's not allowed to do that. So what about Shabbos? Well, it's pretty wild. Ha'amar li Isser Giura. Isser the Ger told me, Ki avinon bar miyusan. When I was a Gentile, Aminon Yehudoi lo minteri Shabsa. We Gentiles, we used to joke, the Jews don't really observe Shabbos. Why don't the Jews really observe Shabbos? The mintri Shabsa, because if the Jews really observe Shabbos, kama kisi kamishtachachi b'shuka. How many purses, how many money bags should we have found Friday evening, Saturday morning in the shuk? Meaning what inevitably happens to Jews on Erev Shabbos? They're stuck in traffic, they're running late. So we'll say, what's the halacha, technically speaking, if Shabbos starts, you're on the journey. And literally, again, Shabbos, what do? You put your money bag down. Isser said, we Gentiles, we used to joke, the Jews don't really keep Shabbos, right? Because if they really kept Shabbos, then we should be finding money every Erev Shabbos, right? Every Shabbos night, or every Shabbos day, from the Jews who deposited their money bags. It was pretty incredible. The Gemara says, "V'lo yedana," but what the Gentiles did not know is the Sfirul and Rabbi Yitzchak. They pass Rabbi Yitzchak. What does Rabbi Yitzchak say? Rabbi Yitzchak, Hamotzi kis b'Shabbos molicho pachos midal ramis. They both say ultimately again, there's a way to deal with this. What's the way to deal with this? walk in increments of less than Dalet Amas. If you do that, then ultimately, again, there's no Akira, there's no Hanocha, there's no Avoda. Of Hilchos Shabbos, because Hilchos Shabbos says you can't transport an item Dalet Amas. So if technically speaking, you walk and you stop and you keep doing this at intervals or increments less than 4 Amas, technically speaking, you avoid Hotzah. Now, not ideal. And I will say, interestingly enough, the Gemara doesn't talk anything about Muktzah. Right? First of all, Muktzah is D'Rabbanan, right? So that came later on. Second of all, the Muktzah issue could be obviated a little bit because by Muktzah, there's a concept that's called Tiltul Minatzad, which means indirect movement. So for example, if my wallet is in my pocket, technically speaking, if I'm carrying that on Shabbos, technically speaking, that is indirect movement of muktzah, right? I'm not actively holding it in my hand, it's being carried on my body. So the point over is, it's interesting, I will say, how the Gentiles used to joke that the Jews don't really keep Shabbos because, again, we're not finding any of their money. We should be finding money on Friday night and Saturday morning. But again, that's because also the Gentiles didn't know the halacha. And the halacha is, again, although not ideal, there is a way even to transport your wallets or your money back on Shabbos. Okay, the one goes weiter. Hano ganavi, tisakile pumpadisa. There were these ganavim, right? These thieves who came to Pumpadisa. Now, what happened to us? It's very interesting. Upaschu chavisa tuva. They opened up a lot. Did I skip? Sorry. Thank you. Who are you? There was a lion that was roaring in the wine in the wine press. Lion roaring in the wine press. Shama ovekochavim. Tasha ben Dani and Akum heard about this, or not heard about this, was there. And they heard the lion roaring. And what did he do? He hid between the barrels. Amar Rav, what's the status of the wine? So Rav said, Chamra the wine is mutter. Why? Meimar Amar, Kihechi de Tashina Ana, Shanami Yisrael Acharei v'kachazali. Because the Akum will say like this, just like I'm hiding between the barrels, so too what? There could be a Jew who's also hiding behind me between the barrels, and he's going to see what I'm doing. Once again, fear of discovery prevents yayin esach. There were these thieves that came to Pumpadisa. Upaslu chavisa tuva. They opened up a lot of barrels of wine. So we'll say, so now the shaila is, what's the status of the barrels? Amar Rava said, Shari. The barrels are mutter. Why? My taima ruba gandhi yisrael minhu. Oh, that's not a good one. Right? I should have let me skip that one. Right? So I say again, and apparently the majority of ganavim ultimately, again, in Pumpadisa, we're Jews. Rabbi will say, here's the good news. They may be Ganavim, but one thing is for sure, which is, they're not of the Avoda Zara. You got to look at the bright side, right? Everyone has faults, everyone has deficiencies, everyone has things that they do wrong. But again, you got to focus on the things that I'm doing right. So they might be Ganavim, but at least they're not idolaters. Incredible. Hava Uvda ben Ardoi. So there was this same episode that happened in Ardon. These thieves were opening up barrels of wine. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Shmuel Silber. Shmuel said, again, passing the wine is mutter. Why? Kiman, Rabbi Eliezer, Da'amar, Safek Bia Tahar. So ultimately, like Rabbi Eliezer, and Rabbi Eliezer says, Safek Bia is Tahar. What does that mean, Safek Bia is Tahar? Let's literally again, which means if you have a Safek about an encounter with Tumah, you're not sure if you encounter Tumah or not, ultimately, again, the Safek is Tahar. What's the case over here? This is not a very interesting case. So we'll say a person walks into a valley, right? Or a plain is actually the better word. Now, a plain, remember again, a plain is a large area made up of multiple individual fields. So a person walks in to the plain during the rainy season, the Tumah Basada. Now, we'll say, now by the way, why during the rainy season, the halacha is like this. During the rainy season, so people have planted. Because people have planted, so generally people don't walk on the fields themselves. They walk on like the perimeter. So the Gemara says like this. So somebody walks into a plain during the rainy season. Now we know that there's tumah. There's a grave in a particular field, right? So Reuben goes through this plain. He says, listen, I know that I walked in this area. What I don't know is, did I go to the field that has the grave or not? That's what's called Safek Bia, right? The Safek of an entry. Did I encounter Tumah or not? Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Safek Biatar, Safek Maga Tameh. Rabbi Eliezer says that if you're not sure if there was an encounter, right? Did you enter into this field? Then ultimately, again, you will be tar. If there's a Safek whether or not you touched Tumah, ultimately, again, that is going to be tamei. So therefore, I will say, B'pashtos, the Gemara is suggesting over here that in this case of Nardo, where the thieves popped open a whole bunch of barrels of wine, this is a case of safek bia, and therefore, Allah L'maisa, the wine should be mutter. So the Gemara says, good. So the Gemara says, lo, shiny hasam, given they get the pasuk of Shemamona, have they svek sveka. Gemara says, no, actually that case is different. Why is the case different? The case of the wine. Here's what's interesting. So apparently, the other thing it was common to put into wine barrels besides wine was money or jewels. In other words, it was like a safe. It's where you hid your stuff. So a lot of times when thieves came and they popped open barrels, they weren't coming for wine. They were looking to see if someone had hid any of their possessions. So therefore the Gemara says it's a svek sveka. Safek number one, again, Safek is just Safek Ukam. So Safek number one is, what is it a Jew, was it a non-Jew? That's Safek number one. And then Safek number two, even if it was a non-Jew, perhaps he wasn't interested in the wine, but rather what? He was looking to see if there were possessions in there. And therefore, again, that Svek Sveka led Rava to say, ultimately the wine is going to be mutter. Incredible. Rava say, I know it is 70b. 70b. Hahi revisa dishtachich dahavis be dani v'amenikita ofia biada. Interesting case. There was a little akum baby. Babala, right? An akum babala, right? So what happened? So the Gemara says, and what happened? And the baby, she had wine foam in her hands, right? Obviously a lack of parental oversight, right? Or just parental desperation, right? We've all had those moments, or just whatever, just take it, whatever it is, right? So the Gemara says, so what happens? So she has wine foam in her hands. So I say, now just to understand, remember, the gzira of stam yenam is on an akum even from 1 day old. From 1 day old. That's the halacha. So now she has wine foam in her hand. The shaila is, did she touch the contents of the barrel or not? So the Rava said chamra shari. So we'll say 70b, second line down. Rava says the wine is mutter. Why? Emar migaba de chavisa shaklase. She took it from the side of the barrel. In other words, we'll say, remember again, the only concern over here with yayin nesach is if the akum touches the interior contents of the wine. We assume over here that halach l'maisa, it must have foamed over, and she got the foam from the side of the barrel, therefore no problem. So the Gemara says, "Va'afak avdoleka su emar is ramuye is ramile." Now, 1 second, you say to yourself, but then shouldn't there be more foam on the side of the barrel, right? Shouldn't there be, if really, so even though there's no foam there now, we assume there was foam there from the beginning, and therefore it's fine. Hahu pulmusa de sakal and arda. There was this pulmusa. And Rashi says over here, pulmusa is Rosh Hagayis Sart Saba, like a general, right? Of a commander of the army. So there was this officer in charge of the army who came to Narda. What happened? Paschu Chavisa Tuva. Now we'll say pulmusa means, or it was like a regiment, like it was a group from the army that came. And what happened? They popped open a whole bunch of barrels. So the Gemara says, Gemara says like this. So they went ahead and they opened up a lot of barrels. Kiyasa Rav Dimi. So ultimately, again, when Rav Dimi came along, so what happened? Amar Uvda Hava Kamed Rabbi Lazar V'Shara. This happened before, right? This happened before. So both say. So again, remember, it was certainly not uncommon for armies coming into cities and taking whatever they wanted. So this has happened before, where they came in and ultimately, again, popped open a whole bunch of barrels. So we'll say the Gemara says. And Rabbi Lazar, I'm sorry. Right. I'm sorry. Kiasar Rav Dimi Amar Uvda Hava Kamed Rabbi Lazar. So this was after Rabbi Lazar V'Shara, and Rabbi Lazar declared that the wine was permitted. V'lo Yedana. Now Rav Dimi said, I don't know. Imishum the Savarla Karabi Eliezer Damar Safek Biatar. Is it because he held like Rabbi Eliezer, like we just saw before, that if there's a Safek Bia, Safek whether or not again there was an encounter with Tuma, the Safek is tar. Is that why he said it was tar? Right? Oh, Imishum the Savar Ruba the Azli Bahadi Pulsuma or Pulmusa, Yisrael Minhu. Interestingly enough, or perhaps it was because that he felt that the majority of Jews or the majority of soldiers conscripted into the army were Jews. See the way Rabbi Lazar, so ultimately again, so Rabbi Lazar said the wine was permitted. I'm just not sure exactly why. So the Gemara says, Ihachi, hi safek bia safek magahu. 1 second. Why are we calling this safek bia? Right? Why are we calling this a safek and whether or not there was an encounter with Tumah? This is not a safek bia. But say, what is this? What is this? This is Safek Maga, whether or not an akum touched the wine. And remember again, Safek Maga is dealt with more stringently than Safek Bia. To which the Gemara said, why is it that we're making over here? I suppose it's very interesting. V'chevan de miftechi tuva ema adaita de mamona paschu ukisafek bia dami. To which the Gemara said, in all of these cases, what was happening over? In all of these cases, there were more barrels than necessary being opened. So when the army comes in and they're popping open more barrels than would be needed to sustain the troops, what does that tell us? What does that tell us? That perhaps this is not about wine, but rather what is it about? What is it about? It's about money. It's about money. They're looking for stuff. So because of that, ultimately, again, you have multiple sveikas over here, right? Was it a Jew? Was it an akum? Even if it was an akum, were they opening it up because ultimately they wanted the wine or because they're looking for riches? You put together all of these sveikas, and what's the result? What's the result? That the wine is going to be permitted. Incredible. Hahu misubisa demasra le eklida maftecha la avodas kochavim. So let's listen to this case. There was a misubisa. What's a misubisa? This was a wine merchant. This was a case. This was a woman, right? A mocheres yayin bechanos. She's a wine seller, a wine merchant, right? She has a store and she sells wine. So we'll say, what did she do? She gave the key to her Gentile, to her akum friend, right? To her akum friend. Rashi says over aklida mafteach shmiras maftechos v'lo samcha daita likones v'nit besas keganav. I will say, Rashi sheds a little bit of light in this case. What's the case? So our muspisa, right, our Jewish woman wine merchant, is leaving her store. She locks it up. She gives the key to her akum friend. Now, what's the job of the akum friend? What's the job? Watch the key. Don't go into the hers. So there's absolutely no feasible reason why the akum should be going into the store, right? If you notice over here, the misubisa told her friend, "Watch my key." She didn't say, watch my store. She didn't say, run my store. She said, just watch my key. So I'll say, what's the halacha? So this case once came up in the base medrash. And they paskin, the wine in the store is mutter. Why? Because remember again, there is no legitimate reason for the akum to enter into the store. Because there's no legitimate reason, therefore what? There's mirsis. There would be fear of discovery. If there's fear of discovery, we could assume that the akum is not entering in. So therefore, because the woman gave her friend just the key to watch, but no access to the store, therefore the wine is mutter. Incredible. Amr Abai says, today we also learn this. Hamoser maftechos la'am ha'aretz taharosav Torah. So this is very interesting. So this is actually a different case, but same concept. So listen to this. Right? Let's say again, I have taras, right? I have produce that I produce in a ritual purity or trumas and maestros in my possession as well. I have a storehouse. I lock my storehouse. I give the keys to my friend who's in Ama Aretz. What's the halacha? Taros of tahoros. My taros remain tar, and we don't assume that the Ama Aretz went in and touched anything. Why? Because remember, in this case, what am I giving over to the Amaret? I'm telling him, watch my keys. I'm not telling him go into the storehouse. Interestingly enough, I'm not even giving him the responsibility to guard my produce. That's not what I'm doing. I'm telling him, watch my keys. That's all I'm telling him to do. Therefore, the Gemara said, we'll say, interestingly enough, hashta, tarosav tahoros, yain esech mibai. So this is going to be the halacha by taras. Is there any shaila by wine? Interestingly enough, the Gemara said, "Lamemra, the taros alimi miyayin esech." Are you telling me then that taros are stricter? The analyst will say, here the argument the Gemara is making. If when I give my key to the Amaretz, my taros remain tahar, then all the more so if I give my key to the akum, my wine is going to remain mutter. Now that argument presupposes that taros are treated more stringently than wine. Is that true? The Gemara says. Is that true? That is true. I'll tell you why. Interesting case here. Right? If let's say I share a chatzar with an Ama Aretz, and what happens? I will say we put a very low divider, like a property line divider between us. Mesivas literally means like with a reed fence. Rashi says mechitza nemucha Am haaretz mitzad zeh v'chaver shetar taros mitzad zeh. So I share property. In other words, we don't share it. We have two adjacent properties, and we have a very low fence that goes between our properties. So what does it mean, very low fence? You can easily reach over one side to the other. Okay. Now remember, on my side, I have taros, right? I have ritually pure produce. The am haaretz is generally someone who is not careful with the halachos of Tumah and Tara. So what's the halacha? So we'll say, so Amarav, taros of Tmeos. Ultimately, and Rav says the halacha l'maisa, we have to assume that at some point in time, the am haaretz kind of reached over the load divider, touched my taros, and therefore my taros ultimately going to become tamei. Yet interestingly enough, by an akum, we don't assume that the akum reached over and touched any of my wine and made it into yayin nesach. Rabbi Yochanan says, what do you see from here? This is interesting. What do you see from Rav? That taros are obviously treated more stringently than yayin nesach, which is quite interesting. Rabbi Yochanan says, now by the way, what's the logic behind that? The logic behind that is, remember, there's a mirsas. An akum is only going to touch wine when? Number one, when there's a legitimate reason for him to be there, and number two, he feels he can get away with it, right? He has time. In this case, there's absolutely no legitimate reason why the akum's hand should be extending over my property line. But by the am haaretz, by the am haaretz, right? Well, whatever, we're all Jews, right? So in other words, his hand could be extending over my property line and touching my stuff, right? So the Maisa, interestingly enough, you see that in this case we are concerned that the taros became tamei, but yet the wine we're not concerned. Rabbi Yochanan says, af taros of toros. Rabbi Yochanan says, no, even the taros ultimately again remain tar. So Rabbi Yochanan is not concerned about that. Rabbi Yochanan feels that halacha l'maisa again, there's no concern, and even the taros ultimately again will remain tar. So we'll stop over here for today. Right, we'll pick up. We're not finished with this case yet, so we'll pick up and answer with the Meisvei tomorrow. And we'll say tremendous shkayach, everyone. Have a wonderful, wonderful day. All right, Chevron Zoom. Have a great day, everyone. Let's go start with all of you.